Basically today I'll be discussing a little bit about ggplot2 4.0.0, which is like a recent major release from ggplot. So it's been a while since they've done a full, I guess a major release where they changed, the first number basically. And so there's a lot of new features. I've gone through and looked at a bunch of this, like there's this blog post that Leo had shared, I think, and there's a huge amount of content that they added. So I'm not going to be going through the whole thing. It's actually there's just a huge amount of content here, but I'll be focusing on some of the features that I found interesting when taking a quick look through. And so I have sort of there's like a small Google Doc. It's very, very simple here, but I shared it in the RStats channel. And basically it's like just linked to the sections that I'm going to be mostly focusing on. So just FYI, in case anyone wants to refer back to this, but it really is all linking to this one blog post anyway. It's just different sections. So yeah, with that, I think we can get started. So I'll skip through some of this stuff there were some fundamental changes to the object itself. So, ggplot2 was, I guess, used S3 objects. Now they use S7. I'm going to skip through a little bit of this, although I believe that this actually did cause some breaking changes for some code. So I guess it's worth noting that some things broke for some developers with this change. And I'll start off with some stuff related to the themes. So I can go through this section a little bit. Basically, they discuss this new feature where basically you can set, in your theme, you can set something called like the ink, which is considered the foreground, and paper. So those are the parameter names, and paper would be the background here. So they sort of make a reference to how this is, in some contexts, this sort of corresponds to what color would be. The color and fill are sort of analogous to ink and paper in certain contexts. So they discuss that a little bit. And I think it's best to just show an example here. So in this first plot, theme gray has existed for a while, right? But now they're providing these parameters, paper, corn silk. So you can see this sort of yellowish color that gives you the background color for the plot. Ink is like the blue, basically the blue you see in this plot. And then I think really the points. And then for other things that don't really map well to ink or paper, like the line in a linear regression fit, they use this parameter accent. So when going through this personally, I was trying to figure out what would be, when I would use this as opposed to just setting maybe like the point colors, the line colors, because you can already do that. I guess you get the background with the corn silk paper in this context. But I was trying to distinguish that from, the features that are already implemented. But I guess it's worth noting that these are some new options that are provided. So they go on to say that you can actually do this in terms of the geoms themselves. So you can define in the theme that you want geoms to have accent tomato, be the paper being the corn silk. Again, I mentioned that like paper is background, and sometimes for certain geoms, like geom box plot, that it would map onto the fill of the boxes. So that's why you see the yellow just inside the box plot boxes here, rather than like where we defined it before for the whole background. So lots you can do here. I am maybe be sort of rushing through this section a little bit, just because I wanted to mention that these are features, but I guess I will be focusing on other things mostly. So this I will skip over a bit. I think sort of the next thing that caught my attention was also with themes. So we're still in this theme section, but basically you can sort of set a default color palette. So in the theme itself, rather than doing it within sort of with like a scale, like the scale functions, like scale color manual or scale fill manual or whatever it might be. So basically, they give an example here where they have a continuous palette and they're setting that in the theme. So they're setting basically the boundaries of this continuous palette to be two different types of green. So I mean, like, again, you can sort of do some of this in the, like with the scale functions, right? So I think this might be useful if you had sort of like a function that defined like a default theme that you wanted for like your lab to use or something like that. Maybe you could have that in a separate file and just sort of import that theme. And then you could sort of get continuous. I don't know. I'm trying to think of use cases for defining this in the theme rather than like with the typical functions. But and also, any sort of aesthetic can be the palette for any aesthetic can be used. So both continuous and discrete, and then they also show like color versus shape. So in this case, they're saying like what options should we use for basically the shape of the in geom. Well, in this case, it's using geom point, right? So geom point is inheriting like the options from this. What they're calling a palette, I guess, just to be consistent with how they apply it for the other aesthetics. So yeah, this could be an interesting thing to sort of apply if we want sort of to inherit options from the theme. So there's a lot going on through here. Again, probably too much to cover in one session. So I'm trying to find the next option. So you can adjust a lot with the scales. Okay, so I think the next thing has to do with faceting. So maybe I'll show the result before showing some of the code, just to give it to motivate things. So basically, with facets now, you can set the individual dimensions of particular facets, which I don't think was possible in any way really before. So again, I'm not sure. Maybe if there were some sort of data you wanted to highlight, or that had more points or something, maybe you could do this. But yeah, I guess like the bottom version is more or less what you'd see before, and then the top version is using this theme subpanel where they use basically a constant height for every panel, but then they're providing a vector of widths. So one for each facet. So this could be potentially useful. Before you would have to do some maybe more complex stuff with like ggplot or one of those other packages to sort of simulate this behavior, but not directly with facets, but anyways. This makes it a little bit easier to do directly with facets. Labels, I'll go ahead and move over this labels section. But briefly, that has to do with making it easier to set the default sort of like corresponding axis titles for given columns. That's sort of the theme around this section that I'm skipping mostly over. And then this is still sort of covering same label type stuff. This section I didn't really understand very much, or that why you would want to do this instead of faceting. So again, I'll probably skip mostly over this. Very briefly here, they show that there's now options to, when you have facets that have a different number, you have a discrete scale that has different numbers of elements within each facet. Do you want the default, which is like the free, I think this is a default, which gives you basically free limits. It fills up the space. So you see that like whether there's 5 elements in the scale, whether there's 4 or there's 3, it fills up the whole width. Whereas there are now options to, again, I don't know why, I'm not really sure why you would use this, to be honest, but it's just an option. So yeah, you don't have to fill, you can sort of line things up. If you had maybe corresponding labels, like in this case, there's compact twice, maybe you could design this scale to basically line up the x-axis across facets if they shared some of the same elements. That might be a use case for this. They show some of these duplicate axes. Again, not sure if that would one to use that. And here's something that's maybe this was also caught my attention. So now they mentioned that like, okay, and ggplot has these layers, right? And the layers consists of geoms, stats, and positions. So this is all like grammar of graphics sort of theory, I guess. And they mentioned that it's easy, or previously stats and geoms have already implemented their own aesthetics. So like I give examples, weight in line with, and they mentioned that position adjustments did not. So if that sounds abstract, we'll show a specific example of what it means for now a position to have an aesthetic. So basically, yeah, again, I think I should probably just show what it looks like to sort of motivate what it means for this to have this feature to be, why this feature is really useful here. So it has to do with these labels, right? So this 0.4, negative 19.49, labeling the values on these bar plots. So if the idea, I think, is that the positions of these labels would be at the end of the bar by default, I believe. And so really you have positive and negative values. So if you have a parameter if you have a function, where is this? Or sorry, yeah, it is a parameter, nudge x for how much you want to move the labels right or left. Well, you can't really set a value for the whole plot. You do want it to be data driven, because the negative values you want to be pushed to the left relative to the default. The positive values you want pushed to the right. And so it does sort of make sense that this position variable should have its aesthetic that inherits from the data rather than some fixed value for nudge x. And so they implement that with doing like sine of the value basically times 3. So 3 units either to the right or to the left, depending on the sign of the data. So this would be one case where you would want positions to have their own aesthetics that are data driven. So yeah, I think I imagine that this is definitely something that we might use in terms of when we do. I guess we don't usually have like negative values but in any case, this seemed like a very practical example to me. They also make a point here where I'm trying to find, I think it's this plot. This is a very specific example, but they show a case where you have basically, in my mind, this is sort of like inverting the axes of a typical box plot with 2 different variables in each, not really facets, but basically you have male and female heights basically for different sports. And then they show that the default way that ggplot would work in terms of cases where some sports only have one sex here, is that basically ggplot isn't going to know where to put the blue versus the red box plots, or it doesn't have really a smart way to deal with that. So you notice with water polo, the blue is below the white line essentially, and for swimming, it's above the white line. And they're saying like basically that might bother you. It might not, but it might. And so they basically have like they added this order aesthetic for position dodge, and so now basically the blue is always on top of the line, and the red is always on the bottom, even if red or blue don't exist for the particular sport that they're looking at. So a very specific example, but just emphasizing that really this new release of ggplot is they're really thinking about customizing, being able to customize almost anything really precisely. So I'll skip mostly over this section as well, but again, I do want to sort of summarize it. Basically, you can, when you have facets that don't divide, a number of facets that doesn't divide evenly between like your row and column dimensions, they show that you have like 7 here. So there's not really a good way to do 7 in terms of 3 rows, 3 columns. So they show that any option you want to do for placing the empty spaces, they pretty much do. They show 2 examples, but that's something you could do. They say that they mentioned that there's actually 8 possibilities really. And the next thing that is sort of interesting here, this has to do sort of, we've talked about the faceting changes with ggplot, this release. And one thing here that I hadn't really thought of before, but they did develop a case for, is that the scales can actually be, the dimensions of the facets can be data driven. And so when they use this, like, I forget if it's it's actually the space equals free x here that is saying like, hey, let's use the x dimension, the dimension that the data spans a certain range in the x-axis, and let's use that range to define how wide the facets actually are. So there could be cases where you're really careful not to distort the size of the data, even across facets, and maybe that would be useful. So it's just another way to do things that are like make more data-driven choices in how you plot things, which is again one of the themes of these new features, I think. So that's kind of cool. Go through this section, and then lots of styling stuff that I found interesting. So they start with like box plots, and so they mentioned like you might know like outlier color, outlier shape, were already parameters that you could set, and now they're like, we just pretty much went ahead and allowed you to style anything and every aspect of this box plot. So they give an example where you see like the dashed line for the whiskers. They have like the median color, the median width even, and then the staple width and color, and colors for the outliers. And so you can be very specific with how you want your box plots to look now, basically. And they've done this with a lot of other geoms as well. So in Crossbar, I've not really used that, so I won't discuss too much about that, but we can go to violin plots. So I'm not sure if I think these quantile color, quantile line type, quantile line width arguments that they mentioned are new. And so they show an example of like geom violin with like quantiles at the 10% quantile, 90%, 90th, I guess. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this. So like normally, I guess, plot is when you'd use a box plot to sort of emphasize the different sort of these ranges, but this is also an option with your geom violin. Geom label now that they cover, and this is, again, you can do lots with the labels. You can get that, we can make dotted lines with outside. You could have different colors here. So I think they're just defining a general aesthetic here for geom labels inheriting. So basically there's a lot you can do now with geom label. I haven't used these area and ribbon plots very much. So they do mention that this is like, you need a compatible graphics device, which I think is interesting. And then the rest is about, you can do very complicated things. I'm not going to cover this, but basically you can have a plot like this where you have like, I guess this is called a convex hull around each of these centroids with different colors and stuff like that. So they mentioned implementing that in terms of basically providing a custom function to one of these the stat manual function. So they define this mix centroids function up here, and then they even use geom polygon with a custom function that they define. So yeah, so they emphasize that like basically stat manual is what they added here, and that's giving these basically the centroids. Yeah, those were the sections I had looked into. There's a lot here that I guess I did rush through a lot of this, but it's probably worth checking out some of these new features. There's probably ones that you might be interested in that I didn't grab my attention specifically, but they really, I mean, this is a major release and they did contribute a lot of new things that are worth checking. They also mentioned they have this section about extending the class and stuff, which I don't think it's interesting. I don't think we haven't really dabbled with that. But this is, I guess, more for developers that are extending graphics related packages where they've made some new additions to that. Yeah, I guess I rushed through this faster than I thought I would, but if there's any questions, I'd love to discuss. But yeah, that's all I had for today.
Thank you, Nick.